Well, welcome again this morning. We are in part 2 of 13 parts, looking at the life of David, but not really at the life of David. We're looking at the heart of David that's revealed through the songs that he wrote out of the history of the events he went through, and that's really what's important here. What I want us to come away with isn't a higher regard for David, but a higher regard for David's God, who met him in tough situations, and that's because we're in tough situations. So I'm hoping this gives you a hunger for coming to God. Say, God, I want you to be a part of my experience. I want you to be in the midst of where I am, and I often exclude you in the hard times. And I want to love you and trust you like David loved and trusted you. And that's really the intention. If you come out after these 13 weeks and say, well, I have a much great appreciation for David, who was a great guy, and I never knew. No, not really, because as we'll find out, David's a very flawed man. And today, we'll see some flaws sticking out all over the place. And yet his relationship with God doesn't suffer in the midst of that. It deepens. Okay, so we'll take a look at that today. So today, we are in this series, 13 Songs of the Past, and we're looking at Psalm 56. So if you want to, you can put a finger there, but we're going to go over into 1 Samuel first before we get to Psalm 56. And we're going to 1 Samuel 21 to find out what's going on. So let me bring you up to date. This is what's at the beginning of Psalm 56. It's a heading, and the heading says, for the choir director, according to Jonath Elam Rahokim. Whatever. Well, actually, the Jonath is the word for dove. Rahokim means far off. And Elam is debated about whether or not it means trees or not, terebinths. But this is like the dove of far off terebinths. Actually, terebinth is not a word you use much. It's a word for a kind of tree in Israel. In fact, it's a tree in the family that makes pistachios. It's a pistachio tree. They also use that same family of trees to make turpentine. So, go figure that out. But the idea, this is a note to the choir director about the melody. Remember we talked about there's always a melody thing in the front? This melody became famous as the sound of a dove far off in a tree. Oh. And it actually fits the context of the history today. You'll hear the sound of a small dove, which makes this sound. Ooh. Not very good. Or something like that. Okay, far off in it. So here's this bird who's very soft-spoken to start with, who's way off out in the middle of nowhere. And that's David's position. So that's the name of the melody. And then right after that, it says historically, a miktam, which just means like a lyrics of David. So David wrote this, when the Philistines seized him in Gath. So based on just that phrase right there, when the Philistines seized him in Gath, we know that this is all about 1 Samuel 21. Because that's when the Philistines seized him in Gath. See? So this is cool. We can put these together. So here's what you're going to do again. We're going to look at the history. We're going to imagine what the song might be like, and then we'll read what the song is that he wrote for real. And you'll find, at least for my case, a remarkable difference in what I would have written based on what happened. So let's go to the history first. You ready? 1 Samuel 21, let's find out what's going on. So I'm going to do an update again on the life of David. This is a short history like before. And so back in chapter 17 of 1 Samuel, David kills Goliath. Everyone knows that story. David's a very young man at the time. And then his popularity spreads throughout Israel. We looked at that last week a bunch in chapters 18 and 19 of 1 Samuel. And his popularity grew so much that David became extremely hated by the king, King Saul. And so Saul at that point determines he's going to kill David because David has become so popular that he might actually steal the throne based on popular following. And so Saul is really freaked out about that. Last week we looked at how David escaped this siege on his home because in chapter 19, King Saul says, I'm going to send my men to the house where David's at with my daughter Michal, and we'll seize him right there and just kill him, when he comes out of the house. Last week he got saved from that, so he survives that siege at his house. And then what we haven't covered, just to fill in the gaps, right after that, what happens in the end of chapter 19, Saul decides to go get David, and David has taken off, and you got to read this. It's the very end. It's like the last, 10 sentences of chapter 19. David runs, when he leaves the house with Michal, he runs out to Samuel. Samuel is the very well-known prophet of Israel. That's why this book is called 1 Samuel, and there's a 2 Samuel. So David runs off to Samuel, the prophet of God, and he runs off to them in Ramah, I think it is. You can read Naoth and Ramah. But he goes to where Samuel is, who's this well-known prophet. Saul sends one team of men to go grab David. And once they get within the proximity of Samuel, they get overcome by God's Spirit and start prophesying. And they can't complete their mission. And then so Saul sends a second group of guys. Same thing happens to them. The Holy Spirit comes upon them, and all of a sudden they start prophesying, basically speaking the truth about David being the anointed king to come, all that kind of stuff. That doesn't work. Saul gets really mad, sends his third contingent to do this. Same thing happens. They get close, and they fall on their knees. They start prophesying because the Spirit of God comes upon them. So Saul says, that's the end of that. I'm going to do this myself. He marches off from his home. He goes over to Ramah, where they are. And when he gets to close proximity, he falls on his knees, takes off his clothes, and starts prophesying for God. No one can get within a radius of David when he's with Samuel because the Spirit of God comes on him and it completely derails their mission. It fails. You got to read it. It's the end of chapter 19. It's the coolest story. So that's what goes on. And from there, David runs off again from the presence of Samuel. As you go through chapter 20, Jonathan, who is the son of Saul and who loves David greatly, finally accepts the truth that his father hates David enough to kill him. Because all the way through chapter 20, David and Jonathan are talking back and forth, and David says, what have I done so wrong that your dad wants to kill me? And Jonathan keeps saying, well, my dad doesn't want to kill you. And David says, well, he does. And Jonathan says, no, he doesn't. So as you read through chapter 20, Jonathan finally comes to realize that his father, the king, Saul, wants to kill David, his very best friend. His very best friend. In fact, it comes down like this in the end of 1 Samuel 20, verse 32. But Jonathan, remember he's the son of Saul, Jonathan answered Saul, his father, and said to him, why should he be put to death? What has he done? And 33, then Saul hurled his spear at him, at Jonathan, to strike him down. And so Jonathan knew that his father had decided to put David to death. Yeah, that was the big sign. Shoom! Throws his spear at him, and Jonathan realizes, oh my gosh, my dad's serious. He really does want to take down my best friend. All of chapter 20 is about Jonathan finally coming to that realization that his dad wants to kill David. And then as we get close to today, Jonathan warns David about his father's real intents, and he uses this thing in the end of 1 Samuel 20, what I call warning through archery, where Jonathan says, we got to be careful about this because if you get too close to my house where the king Saul is, he'll kill you. I'll tell you what happens. Some events are going to transpire, some festivals basically. You should be expected to be sitting at the table with all of us in the king's house and stuff, and you're not going to be there. I'm going to find out for once and for all whether or not my dad can be turned, whether his anger against you can change. And I'll do this. If you just hide yourself out in this field, then sometime after that, I'll do kind of what I call an archery semaphore. That is, I'll be out there like I'm shooting target practice with a bow, and I'll shoot it. I'll bring a small boy with me who will retrieve my arrows, because you never throw away arrows. And if I tell the boy who's retrieving arrows on the edge of the field where you're hiding, David, if I tell the boy, no, my arrow's not there, it's further out. If you hear me yell out to him, it's further out, then that means my dad wants to kill you. And sure enough, as you read through that chapter, that's exactly what happens. He calls out, my arrow's further past that. The boy finally collects the arrow. Jonathan gives his bow and his arrow and all of his gear to this little boy and says, take it back to the house for me. The boy runs away, leaving Jonathan and David in this remote field. And it's a really tender scene in the end of chapter 20 where Jonathan and David embrace. They cry. It says, David cried more. It's a very tender thing. And they split. And these two men that love each other so much. And finally, David runs off into the wilderness, and Jonathan has to stay home and support his dad, Saul. It's a really incredible scene. So David runs off, leaving his best friend behind, not knowing when he's ever going to return to where Saul's dominion is, because Saul is hell-bent on killing him. And that's where we get today. He's running for his life, is what it is. That's where we get to. So let's start today's narrative at 1 Samuel 21, verse 1, and this is the next place David goes to after that. So David came to Nob, to Ahimelech, or if you want to be accurate, Ahimelech, but I can't say that too often without hurting myself, so I'll say Ahimelech. He goes to Nob to Ahimelech, the priest, and Ahimelech came trembling to meet David and said to him, why are you alone and no one with you? So here's this priest who does his thing, and David, who's a very well-known general and commander of the armies and very skilled himself in the military arts, comes looking like an assassin, one man. He comes to Nob, which is theoretically where the tabernacle is. We're not sure, but probably. And he comes to the priest, and the priest is scared to death because here's this man who is known as being a swordsman and a killer is there all by himself. He's really freaked out. So he comes out terrified. Why is there no one with you? And then David spins in this yard. Verse 2, David says to Ahimelech the priest, well, the king has commissioned me with a matter and has said to me, let no one know anything about the matter on which I'm sending you and with which I have commissioned you, and I have directed the young men to a certain place. Total lie. What he says is, I'm on a mission from the king all by myself. This is a special secret mission. Not anybody knows about this. Don't tell anybody about this. It's secret, and the men have gone to another place, and I'm going to meet them there, so everything's okay. Everything's okay. Total lie. It's a total lie. Just sort of to put Ahimelech's, Ahimelech to make him feel a little bit better about all of this. And so David says to Ahimelech the priest, now therefore, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever can be found. So he's running for his life. He's run so quickly away from home, he didn't have any chance to prepare, so he's running without any food on hand. So he comes to the priest and says, have you got any bread? 5 loaves will do. 5 loaves will do. Now, from some other accounts, we know that David does have plans to meet up with some other men later. So he's probably gaining enough food for a handful of people. So do you have some bread? Whatever can be found. Now, the priest answers David and says, well, there's no ordinary bread on hand, but there is consecrated bread. So if only the young men have kept themselves from women. So what's the consecrated bread? Consecrated bread? Well, we're at a holy place right here, probably at the tabernacle. And what this is God told the nation of Israel when they had the tabernacle and later the temple that one of the things I want inside there is a table of showbread. That's what we call it, because what he told the priest to do is there's this table. I think you can read about it in Exodus 24:25. Build this table about 2 arms long and 1 arm deep and about 1.5 arms tall. Make it out of acacia wood, cover it with gold, put rings on it so you can put poles through it so you can carry it around. And on this pretty table inside the temple, I want you to bake bread every week, every Sabbath, 1 loaf for every tribe of Israel. So there's 12 of these loaves, and line them up 6 in one row and 6 in another row, and put them right there and have them actually in the presence of God in the temple, showing to God these bread inside there. And then when every Sabbath comes along, you need to renew that bread, take the old stuff out, bake some new stuff, put 12 more in, line them up 6 and 6. So what the priest is saying is, we've got the bread that we just took off of the show bread table. You could eat that. But there's a hitch. And what the priest is saying is that, but this is holy bread. If you look in Leviticus 24, it says that this bread, after it gets taken off of its show place on the table, it can be eaten by the priest, but it's very holy. This is special kind of bread. It's consecrated. So you don't just give it away to people to eat. So the priest says, well, maybe I can give it to you if the men that are in your band that are going to eat this are kind of sexually pure right now. Maybe that'll work, I guess. And I don't know where he's getting this from, because that's not anywhere in Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Number. That's not anywhere. So he says, maybe that's, it's consecrated, it's special stuff. So here's a reenactment of that table made out of acacia wood, covered with gold, with a 6 and 6 and all that kind of stuff, and a really good-looking high priest. Woo! But anyway, that would be inside the temple. So he's got the stale versions of that. It's like week-old bread. So David answers the priest and says, well, about the women thing, well, surely women have been kept from us, as previously, when I set out, and the vessels of the young men were holy, that's their bodies, though it was an ordinary journey. So how much more than today will their vessels be holy? It's just David saying back, oh, yeah, we're okay. we're pure enough. We can eat the bread. Yeah, that's okay. That's fine. No women. That's good. Because he wants the bread. Remember, it's a week-old stale bread, but it's still food when you're running in the wilderness. So that's what he's doing. So he says, yeah, this will be okay. Well, so the priest gave him consecrated bread, for there was no bread there but the bread of the presence, actually literally the bread of the face, the bread that was in God's face is what the presence means, which was removed from before the Lord in order to put hot bread in its place when it was taken away. Oh yeah, there's my reference. Leviticus 24, if you look more at this whole thing, 24, 5 through 9, it says right there explicitly that the priests are the ones who get to eat the bread when it's taken away from that place. And the priests, by the way, very clear to understand who the priests are because they come from the tribe of Levi and the sons of Aaron specifically. So that's what's going on. But David has it now. Now I want you to look at this, and this is going to make you scratch your head for a while. In Matthew 12, Jesus mentions this event. And it says right there, Matthew 12:1, at that time Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples became hungry and began to pick the heads of the grain and eat. But when the Pharisees saw this, they said to them, hey, look, your disciples do what's not lawful to do on a Sabbath, because they were harvesting to eat. And Jesus says to them, have you not read that what David did when he became hungry, he and his companions, how he entered the house of God, and they ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those with him, but for the priests alone? So Jesus is even commenting on this particular thing. Now, I'm not going to tell you what Jesus is talking about right there in Matthew 12, and I want you to go look at that. Just kind of expand that a little bit and find out why Jesus is pointing back to this very event we're reading about in 1 Samuel 21 today. Why that's so important in this event where his apostles are eating grain. So that's your bonus work, if you want to do that. It's in Matthew 12. Find out how that applies and why that's important. It's also in Luke 6, verses 3 and 4. You can go, it's a parallel passage. So anyway, so that's what's going on. He's taking this consecrated bread that's meant really for just the Levites to eat. So, verse 7. This is what I call an inclusio. This is not part of the story, but it is part of the story because you'll need this. Verse 7. One of the servants of Saul, so he's loyal to Saul, was there that day, detained before the Lord there with the priests, and his name was Doeg, the Edomite, the chief of Saul's shepherds. Well, what does it have to do with anything? It has everything to do with something that's going to happen pretty soon. So remember, David came to Nob, to the priest, and said, psst, I'm on a secret mission from the king. All by myself. That's why you don't see an army and stuff like that. It's secret. But there with the priest that day, Doeg, who's loyal to Saul. And what does Saul want to do to David? Kill him. Doeg, the Edomite. Doeg, that Edomite. And by the way, Edomite is a slight, what do you want to call it? Insult? What do you want to say? Slur, insult. Oh yeah, it's a slur against, because Edom is like the half-brothers of Israel. You have Jacob and Esau. Remember Jacob and Esau? Jacob turns into Israel and has his 12 sons that become the tribes. Jacob and Esau goes off into the wilderness, and Esau starts a land called Edom, and that's the Edomites. So they're cousins back to Jacob and Esau. So Doeg the Edomite sees what's going on here, and it's important because David will actually write a song condemning Doeg. And we're going to read about that on October 12th. And it's a doozy. It's a doozy. Because, I don't want to spoil it, but here's a plot warning. Doeg does one of the most despicable things in the entire Old Testament. Horrible. 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 And David will write a psalm we'll look at in a couple weeks about that. So just tuck that in your back pocket. Doeg the Edomite sees David come today to the priest. Okay, so we continue our story. Verse 8. David says to Ahimelech, now, is there not a spear or a sword on hand? I brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me. Because the king's matter was urgent.
He wasn't lying.
He's lying again. I don't have a spear. I don't have a sword. I don't have all the other stuff because I was just in a rush because the king sent me off really quickly. Total lie. So he's saying to the priest, now this is a priest who's serving God, presumably in the tabernacle. You got any weapons here? Got any weapons? Anything will do. Weapons? So the priest says, amazingly, the sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, hey, it's wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. Whoa! So if you take it for yourself, take it. Hey, for there's no other accepted here. So hey, you remember that big guy? Remember him? 9 feet tall? Remember that guy that you killed? And his sword that you used to cut off his head? I got it wrapped in the back. And take it. And then he says a really remarkable thing. There's no other accepted here. We got nothing else. If you want something, take the sword of Goliath. That'll work. Now use your imagination for a second. Remember, Goliath is 9 feet tall. And your sword is proportionate to your size. Right? So this, for David, is a gigantic thing. It's a big thing. And also, since Goliath was a champion, this sword would be It would be marked and emblazoned in a special kind of way because he's the champion of all the Philistines. It would have markings on it that would be very distinguishable. I mean, anyone who sees this sword would say that belongs to a big guy and that belongs to a big guy champion. And so the priest says, take that. And David says, cool, I will. But keep that in mind for a second. So there's my best picture I could find. There's David as a scrawny little kid, probably not too far off. And there's the Philistine champion, Goliath in the background, laughing, ho, 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 ho. And there's his sword right in front of him. So it's a big hanging sword. So David says, there's none like it. Give it to me. There's none like it. This is like the best of the best. There's none like it. Ho, 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 ho. And he sees this powerful sword. Now, before we march on, did that sword help the Philistine champion? No. But David thinks it's going to help him today. And now you start to see where David's actually, his thinking is twisted as he's taking all this stuff. He thinks it's going to help him. Hey, give it to me. There's none like it. Verse 10. So David arose and fled that day from Saul and went to Achish, king of Gath. Wait a second. Wait. Gath. Does that ring a bell? Go back to the story of David and Goliath, 1 Samuel 17:4. Then a champion came out from the armies of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits in a span. A cubit is about as long as your forearm, so that makes him about 9 feet tall. So wait, when I read this, I hear the tires screeching on the pavement as I stop really quick. I say, wait a second, you're carrying the sword of Goliath back to his hometown. You think anyone will notice? What are you doing? And stop one other thing. Why in the world are you running into the Philistines' camp? These guys hate you. You humiliated them when you killed their champion. So you're running away from Saul, and it's a pretty good bet that Saul's not going to follow you into the Philistines. True, so he's getting away from Saul. But why in the world would you run to Gath? Ping! And you know what? We don't know the answer to that. It's the craziest thing in the world. David is so scared of Saul, who wants his life, and he's running at the fastest speed possible. The first place he goes to after leaving Nob and the priest is he goes to Goliath's hometown and actually the capital of the Philistine Empire. What are you thinking? And not only that, he's got a billboard that he's carrying around that looks like the sword of Goliath, that tells everyone around. You know, when you conquer someone in battle, you think of the generals and stuff like that. When you conquer someone in battle, the conquering general will come back in town and he'll be carrying the sword of the person that he vanquished. So it's like David's coming in saying, I'm the guy. Now, at this point, you can kind of speculate. Maybe David thought that if he came into Gath carrying Goliath's sword, they would be intimidated enough that they wouldn't touch him. Because they know that he himself is a champion that vanquished their champion, and it'll make him untouchable, and maybe they'll fear me enough, because, I mean, there's no way I'm going to hide who I am, because culturally you can tell he's not a Philistine, but then he's carrying this prize. Maybe he's thinking, and this is all speculation, maybe they won't touch me because they'll be too afraid of me. Because after all, the whole Goliath incident wasn't that long ago. And from that point to this point, David has had some very successful military campaigns. Read 1 Samuel 18, 19, 20. Very successful campaigns against the Philistines. They know who this guy is. Maybe if he just comes in here carrying a reminder of the fact that the first thing he did against the Philistines was kill their champion, and now he's been killing their armies ever since, maybe they won't touch me. And you know, that's the best guess we can think about why he would do something so crazy as run to Gath carrying this, I don't know. But that's what he does. That's what he does. But the servants of Achish said to him, hey, is this not David, the king of the land? Did they not sing of this one as they danced, saying, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s? Oh, reputation precedes him. So the king's servants say, it's David, which is a total duh. I think everyone knows that. Isn't this the guy who has done this? Isn't this the guy who's the military general? Isn't this the guy who killed our Goliath? Isn't this the guy? Now, at this point in the story, if you're writing a story, if you're just writing stories, the plot line can go one of two ways. They can go the one way where these guys cower and say, run away, he's dangerous, he killed Goliath, he'll kill us as well, ah! And they'd run away with their hair on fire. And then the other side, would they say, well, he's just a guy, and he's all alone. You go one of two ways. Actually, what you're doing is you're replicating what happened on the battlefield with Goliath. Goliath came out and saw David and said, what is this? What is this? Come on, give me. That's why that picture shows him laughing. This is a single little kid, you know? So we'll just take him. Or maybe they know he's a champion. So right here, you get the plot line could go one of two ways. And here's how the plot line goes. So David took these words to heart, and he greatly feared Achish, king of Gath. He got apprehended. And the little champion was now incarcerated. And he realized, I'm in deep weeds. I'm in really deep weeds. What am I going to do? You know, and you got to stop right here and just, you have to soak this in. This greatly feared is it's a terrified kind of word. And the closest illustration I could think of today is some pictures you've seen of some of the horrible beheading violence you see from ISIS or ISIL or whatever you call them. And there's that poor person right there. And they have no future. They realize that in minutes they'll be dead. And that's exactly what David is realizing. In minutes I'll be dead. Because the whole ploy about maybe fooling them because I'm a champion and they won't touch me hasn't worked because they've grabbed me. And evidently, I'm toast. He greatly fears at this point. Now, we're going to stop the narrative a little bit right here even more, because you have to understand that what David has done is he's in his running away from Saul is he's used all these man-made ploys to get what he thinks is going to work out for him. And let me show you what I'm talking about right here. For instance, he took the action of lying to God's priests, and for the purpose of saying, I really have the authority from the king. This is up and up with the king. He lied. He lied to represent his authority to this priest, so the priest would cooperate with him, for one thing. He eats the holy bread, which actually is illegal. You're not supposed to do that. And he does that just to gain strength, so he'll have something to eat and he can stay alive while he's going, right? And then thirdly, he arms himself so that he'll have some kind of vestige of power. And these are all man-made things. These are all things that you do on your own, which sort of makes sense, right? They make sense. You do this if you're on the run. If you're a refugee in that sense, you do this on the run to arm yourself and protect yourself. But David's done everything he can think of in his own power to protect himself. And in a split second, as he walks into Gath, he's apprehended, and now he fears greatly. He greatly fears for himself. He realizes that none of these things he's done has accomplished anything. And he's totally exposed. And see, here's the problem. When David goes into a situation like this, like we do, and if we say to ourselves, well, here's the situation, here's the threat to my life, I need to do everything that I can think possible, that I can help myself, because I, and no one's going to help me except me, so I'm going to do everything I can do. And the problem is if you put your trust in yourself, you only have yourself. You don't have God. So very clearly at this point, David has left God behind and done everything he can do in a man's perspective that seems wise, and it hasn't afforded him anything at all. It's failed him. His reputation as the Goliath killer, his entire reputation as a general, everything, and even armed himself, everything he's done is backfired, and he's been incarcerated because he's trusted in himself and not trusted in God. For instance, just before this, remember when he's over there with Samuel, and Saul keeps sending these guys, including himself finally, and God descends on these people when they get close enough and completely incapacitates them before they even get close to David. Now that sounds like a really good defense. And it has nothing to do with picking up the sword of Goliath. It has nothing to do with anything else. Your reputation, it's nothing of that. God protected him. But in this case, he goes totally out on his own and does one of the most unwise things you can ever think of. He runs into the enemy's camp. I mean, all of his judgments are just wrong all the way through this. And where does it get him? He greatly fears. He realizes that he's put himself. So at this point, he's really toast. Now, it's an interesting contrast if you go back to the narrative of David and Goliath back in Samuel 17. Remember, little David comes up to Saul and he says, let no man's heart fail on account of him, of Goliath. Your servant, talking about himself, will go and fight with this Philistine. You know, one of the first things David does as this little shepherd boy, when he sees the champion out in the field, he comes to Saul, the king, and he says, don't let any man's heart fail. You know what that really means? Don't let anyone fear. I'll take him on. I'll take him on. What a difference it is where you have this young man who sees this animal in Goliath, and he says, God who protected me from the lion and the bear and all this, he's just another animal in that sense. No one needs to fear. I'll just take him down. Is that okay? No fear. And he's trying to tell everyone else, don't fear. But here, he's trusted in himself, and now he greatly fears. What a huge contrast. And if you stop just for a second and think about it, when we're in tough situations, that's exactly what happens to us. When we get into a situation where the circumstance is that threatening because you're smart enough to understand how the circumstance can take you down, one of the first things you do is say, well, if I'm on my own, I'm toast. And so all you can do is fear. All you can do is fear. Because you realize that the threat and your ability to deal with the threat will not match. You realize you're way overpowered, so all you can do is fear. But when you realize that you're going to put your trust in God, it changes that entire equation for you. So David had the equation right when he fought Goliath. He does not have the equation right today when he's captured by the king. Later on in the David and Goliath thing, David says, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion, from the paw of the bear, he'll deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. Do you sense any fear in that statement? No. Because the God who has been my defender will continue to be my defender. But today, when David in his bad judgment ran to his enemies for protection, he ran to his enemies for protection. He ran away from God. And now he fears greatly. See the contrast? That's what's so amazing right here. At this point in the narrative, we're going to push on here, he realizes, I think, and this is my speculation, that he's been a fool up to here. Because now he's being held by the king's guys. They've fingered him as being David, the one who's killed his 10,000s versus Saul's thousands. They understand he's the one that killed Goliath. And I think he realizes, I'm an idiot. I'm an idiot. And there's this greatly fearing, I think he realizes I'm an idiot. So you know what he does next in the story? He plays the idiot. He plays the fool, and this is what happens. 13. So he disguised his sanity before them, acted insanely in their hands, scribbled on the doors of the gate, and he let his saliva run down into his beard. Play the fool. Because actually, the irony is he is the fool. What he's done up to this point, he's been an idiot at. Yeah, Sheila. Acting as a madman. Yeah, and he plays being a madman. He plays being totally out of his senses, which, if you're watching really cool American TV, this is a cool deal, right? Because look what happens. It works. Then Achish says to his servants, behold, you see the man behaving as a madman. Why do you bring him to me? Do I lack madmen? That you have brought this one to act the madman in my presence? Shall this one come into my house? You think I don't have enough crazy people in Philistia? Come on. And so David departs from there and escapes to the cave of Adullam. It works. Now, at this part of the story, and this is where we're going to end the story before we get to the psalm, at this part you would have to say, wow, what a clever guy David is. But you can't forget those words that he greatly feared. He realized that he had gone in on his own power and he was toast. But somewhere in the story, he allows God to become part of the story. And I think God convinces him that he's been an idiot. He's been a fool to trust in himself. And all it's done is garnered great fear and jeopardy from the enemies of God. And he plays the fool and he's released. Now, what kind of psalm do you write? What kind of psalm do you write? Do you write a psalm that says, gosh, when you're totally out of power, act like an idiot, people will think you are and let you go, pretty smart. MacGyver would have done it, so I would. You can't go there because you can't get away from the fact that David greatly feared. He really painted himself into a stupid corner because he acted like a fool when it came to God defending him. So, how do you write a psalm that says, I was an idiot? Here it is. You ready? He greatly feared. So we go into Psalm 56, verse 1. Be gracious to me, God, for man has trampled upon me. Fighting all day long, he oppresses me. My foes have trampled upon me all day long, for they are many who fight proudly against me. And like many of his other songs, he starts off with the circumstance. God, let me tell you what's going on. Now, what he's doing is he's talking about not only the Philistines, he's talking about Israel under the guidance of Saul, who wants to kill him. He's saying, everybody wants to kill me. Gosh, since I've killed Goliath, all the Philistines have wanted to kill me, but now all of Israel wants to kill me. I got nowhere to go. God, everybody tramples on me. Everybody. No one's in my camp. No one's in my camp. There's many who fight proudly against me. So I'm toast. I'm outnumbered, and I have nowhere to go for refuge. They all want a pound of my flesh. And then he says the best part of this entire psalm. When I'm afraid, I'll put my trust in you. In God, whose word I praise. In God, I have put my trust. I shall not be afraid. Now remember I told you the key part of the narrative was he said he was greatly afraid. So keep watching for fear in this psalm, because that's really the issue. That's the reaction to when you put your trust in yourself. Now this right here is a thing that we call a chiasmus. And you can see it better if I kind of stretch it out like this. A chiasmus is where it's a literary form where you write into something and then you turn around and you write out of that thing. You reverse it. You go in forward and you reverse it and you come out. And the reason for this literary form is it causes you to focus on the center like it was the center of a target. So see what he says? He says, when I'm afraid, and he was greatly afraid, I will put my trust in you, as opposed to put my trust in me. I'll put my trust in you. In God, whose word I praise. And then as he comes out, see how it mimics the other one? In God I have put my trust. I will put my trust. I gotta have put my trust. And then as a result, I shall not be afraid. Now this is really good technique when you're in circumstances that cause you to fear. Because fear is a statement that the circumstances are bigger than you are, and that's okay. But the circumstances are never bigger than God is. So what you need to do is when you fear, because that's the immediate response, put your trust in God. And why? And this is what I find fascinating. That's the target right in the center. In God, whose word I praise. Now, why would he? That's not what I would write. I would say, I put my trust in God, who's more powerful than all my stupid enemies. Or in God, who has protected me in the past. Or in God, who is really, really big, and he makes everybody who's bad go away. Or in God, I talk about the power of God. But instead what he says, I'll put my trust in God, whose word I praise. Now, what does that mean? In his word that I praise. When someone makes a promise to you, if that person is faithful and trustworthy and has the power behind it to back up that promise, then you can say, I will engage in trust on behalf of what they have promised. And that's exactly what David is saying here. God has spoken to me his word and said that I love you, I'll protect you. He's even anointed him as the next king of Israel already. Go back to 1 Samuel 16. God knows that David had heard his voice, and God knows that David has heard his promises. And so when David needs to put his trust in someone other than himself, he puts his trust in the God who has promised. That's his word. That's his word. And as we continue on, you'll see that's what you do in hard times as well. You ask yourself, can I trust God in this situation? I mean, is he really trustworthy? If I say, God, I'm going to put myself in your hand, will God really come through for me? How do I know he'll do that for me? Does he love me? Ding, yes. Does he have the power to protect me? Ding, yes. Does he see my situation? Ding, yes. I'll never leave you nor forsake you. And then you can go through all the promises about who God has said he is in your life and wants to be in your life. If you'll be my people, I'll be your God. It's like winning the lottery big time. So David puts his trust in the God who has spoken his promises to David. And so David can rest his mind. See the next line? So I have put my trust in God. In God I put my trust. So I won't be afraid. And then this is a total switch over from me in charge to God in charge. It's classic. Me in charge and fearing, God in charge, I don't fear. This is a classic theme throughout the entire Old Testament and the New. And it's one of the key skills that David needs when he becomes king of Israel sometime later. Because all through his life as king, the nation of Israel will be attacked and surrounded by people who want to take him down. And David repeatedly says, well, God, I'll fight these guys, but it's your battle, God, not my battle. It's your battle, not my battle. And where does he learn that? Right here. And in the subsequent years as he's running from Saul. And we'll see in those Psalms. It's God's battle. I shall not be afraid. He goes on. What can mere man do to me? And you chuckle at that and say, well, they can kind of like rip your arms off and make you miserable. I mean, they can do a lot of things. What do you mean, what can man do to me? I can, give me a half a minute and I'll come up with a list. But he's really being bigger than that. He says, what can man really do? I mean, really. And that's where I hear the words of Paul saying, what can separate you from the love of Christ? Anything? Anything? Nothing. Nothing. So what can mere man do to me? He brings into his song. I mean, all day long, they distort my words. They lie about me. All their thoughts are against me for evil. All their intentions are to take me down. 6, they attack. They lurk, like preying lions. They watch my steps as they've waited to take my life. I mean, they've got plans, is what verse 6 is. They've got plans to take me down. They're against me all the time. But what can mere man do to me? Really, really. Because of wickedness, cast them forth. In anger, put down the peoples, O God. So he's saying, I'm surrounded by people who actively have plans to take me down. They spend their waking hours making plans how to kill me. I don't think any of us in this room have any experience like that, where someone actually spends their day coming up with the best plan to kill you. And if I knew that, oh my gosh, if I knew that, I'd sit around and worry all day long. Is it going to be when I walk out of the house here? Is it going to be when I go down the street? I mean, when's this going to happen? You worry about that all the time. And David's saying, I know that they're planning my death all the time. But, last line, put him down, God. Put him down. Now, you see, he says, put down the peoples. The peoples. Again, he's drawn this back out to when he's going to be king of Israel. When nations, when peoples, when the Goyim have surrounded Israel and want to take down the entire nation of Israel. He's saying at that time, I'll just use the same thing. God, they have active plans to take me down, but God, this is your battle. This is not my battle. So God, take them down. One of the most important things a king can ever understand when he's in charge of God's sheep, which is what David will become. He'll be the under shepherd for God himself as being the king. The best thing he can say is to God, God, you need to intercede on behalf of your people. Most kings do the opposite. Most kings get into power and they see how many horses and how many soldiers and how many swords they got and they think, we are powerful, right? And then it goes to their head, they get prideful about that, and then they fall. And if you look at the nation of Israel's history, that's exactly what happens to the bad kings. But the good kings say, God, this is your battle. You have saved us in the past. You will save us in the future. And God, these are your people, not my people. You need to intercede on behalf of your people. And so the really godly kings in Israel, starting with David, started this pattern of saying, people, we need to come to God because he is our true king. I'm just the in-between king for a while. He's our true king. And David writes later, and he says, it has nothing to do with how many horses you've got. It's not in the power of the horse. That's not it at all. We have a king whose power and whose love for us is bigger and broader and more powerful than anyone's planned hate for us every day. And that's where we're at as well. In the same place. We'll talk more about it in a second. He goes on in the song. You've taken account of my wanderings. Now this is David. He's running away from home. He's everywhere. Now he's in his enemy's camp. You've taken account of my wanderings. God, you've put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your book? This is the tenderest moment in probably all of David's Psalms. He says, God, you can take them down because I know, God, that you see my tears. I know that you see my tears. And not only that, you collect my tears in a bottle. Now think about it. What are the things that show up in bottles in the Old and New Testament? Remember when that woman came to Jesus? Special, expensive things. Things highly treasured. Remember that? Highly treasured things. That woman that had that precious fragrance inside that bottle, very, very valuable. Very valuable. What David is saying right here is that the tears of your people are as precious as perfume that you put in a bottle. And you actually collect it up. You never lose it. It gives this picture of the fact that all through life, in all the tears that you'll have, for you or for David or any of us, we don't have a God who doesn't care about where we are. We have a God who's collecting our tears in a bottle as precious. We don't have a God who's far away, who kind of whipped this whole place together and threw us into it and says, well, good luck with all that. Call me if you got problems. He's a God who's near, who sees your tears, and not only sees your tears, but he collects them as one of the most valuable treasures that he has. Now, if you have a God like that, will he intercede in your problems? Will he? Not only that, they're indelibly written in a book. See, a book is what, at the time, what kings keep for histories of the most important events in life. And not everyone keeps records in books. Only the important people who have important events put things in books. And what he's saying is that not only does he collect your tears in a bottle, but he takes the very events that you're in the midst of and he writes them in a book so that they'll never be forgotten. Now there's also a judgment side of that line about putting them in a book. Because someday God can open a book and say, my loved one whose tears I collected were in this circumstance, and it says right here that you did this to them. So it actually also implies judgment coming on the ones who are involved in this. God is not so distant and disconnected that he doesn't care what you're going through, nor is he informed poorly about what's happening. He knows exactly because he's the God that's near. And all David had to do in this circumstance was recognize that my God is near. And he collects my tears in a bottle. That's how much he loves me, and he will intercede on my behalf. So listen, just a quick application break. If you're in a situation now that caused you to cry, and there's a lot of those situations where your heart is just breaking inside, you're tempted to think God doesn't see. And if God did see, he doesn't care. Or else why would I be going through this? Why has God allowed me to go through this? But I want you to go back and remember that God loves you and is eager to show his love for you. And every tear that you shed, he collects in a bottle. That's how precious it is. And if this God loves you and sees you to that extent, you can call on his name and say, God, in simple words, help. And he's eager to show his loving kindness to you. There's no circumstance that you'll ever go through that causes tears in life where God is unaware of what you're going through or uncaring about what you're going through, but he is eager for you to invite him into the circumstance. Rather than what David did today, where he ran off and got a big sword and went off to his enemies and did a whole bunch of stupid stuff. God's waiting to be included because he treasures every tear. There's not a single tear you shed that he wastes. He collects them. We take tears and wipe them off our face, use Kleenexes and sop them away. He comes to you with a little bottle and collects them. So don't ever say God doesn't care. Don't ever say God doesn't love you. And don't ever say that God doesn't understand, because he does. He does. In the New Testament, we're told about Jesus himself, our high priest. It's not as though he can't identify with our sufferings, because he's been in our shoes and come out of it sinless. He loves you. And that's what David's saying right here. This is why he can trust in God next time he fears, because God sees what's going on. He treasures the problems that I'm in. He loves me so much, he will intercede on my behalf. And then I don't fear. I mean, what an incredible truth it is to suddenly have in your mind a collision between the threats of life and the power and loving kindness of God, and they come together, and the result isn't an explosion, it's peace. And that's why Jesus said, I bring you peace that the world will never understand. Just never understand. Now, he never says that peace will result because I'm going to completely wipe the circumstances that threaten you away. Those circumstances may say. But the peace that comes from understanding that God's in control and he's not forgotten you. No fear. Okay, said too much on that. Let's move on. Then the enemies will turn back in the day when I call. See that? In the day when I call, my enemies will turn back. In the day that I run into Gath carrying the sword of Goliath and go into my enemy's camp, I'm hoping that I'm intimidating them with my reputation. Blah, 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 blah. They won't turn back. But in the day, God, when I turn to you, they'll turn back. They'll turn back. That's what you got to do. Jim, what do? You call. You call on his name in the day when I call. So this I know. He makes a list. God is for me. So if you're in one of these blinding circumstances that's just making you crazy with fear and you forget everything else we talked about today, can you just remember that? God is for me. God is for me. No, God is for me. God is for me. This is what I recall in my mind. See, that's what he says. It's part of the process of pulling yourself out of the self-pity and fear of the circumstances. This I recall, I bring to mind, God is for me. Now, why do you have to say that? Well, because the circumstances say, God has forgotten you. That's what the circumstances want to say. And that's what you're tempted to think. God has forgotten you. God's busy on the other side of the universe, running some other stuff. I don't know what he's up to, but maybe he's asleep or something like that. But God is clearly not caring for you. He's not on your side. Good luck with that. You're on your own. Right? That's what your circumstance says to you. But your mind says, no, God is for me.
Jim, Sheila has a question.
Sheila. Then who can be against you? And that's why he says, what can mere men do to me? Really?
He cannot do nothing.
Right. This I know, God is for me. In God, there it is again, whose word I praise. When he says word, that's the sum total of the promises that God has made on behalf for you for your benefit. He said that. In his word, that's what I praise. In the Lord, whose word I praise, he just uses another name for God right there. In God, I have put my trust. And why? Because he's for me and he's made promises to me in his love. So, I shall not be afraid. You notice how many times fear has come up in this psalm? That's why he did the stupid thing. A stupid thing when he came to Achish and went to Gath. And it resulted in great fear. And now he says, I've learned. I've learned. I'll put my trust in him. I'll put my trust in his promises and his word to me. When I do that and when I call on his name, my enemies will retreat and I have peace. I shall not be afraid. What can man do to me? He goes on, your vows are binding upon me, God. I'll render thank offerings to you. When he says that your vows are binding upon me, what he's saying basically is that if God has interceded on my behalf, I need to go to him and give sacrifice to him and thank him. I need to formally and ritually thank him for what he's done for me. That's what these vows are. If God intercedes on your behalf, well, you need to go to him and thank him. And they had a formalized way of doing that in Israel. But you need to do that as well, even when you're in the midst of an unresolved conflict. Okay, so God is for me. I trust in his word of promises to me. He loves me. I will not fear. And now the next step is thank him. And you'll find as you're watching through these Psalms that David starts the Psalm with, oh no, the sky's falling. Everything's bad. Now let me tell you how bad it is. They lurk for me at night and make plans. And it starts really bad. And at the end, he transitions to, thanks God. We're good. He ends with thankfulness. He ends with thankfulness, even when it's unresolved. 13, for you, not me, you have delivered my soul from death, indeed my feet from stumbling, so that, guess, so I can carry a sword.
There were no archers.
You have delivered my soul from death, indeed my feet from stumbling, so that, huh?
You love me.
You love me? Well, that's true. Here's the purposes for why God intercedes on your behalf. You ready? So that I might walk before God in the light of the living. So I can walk before the Lord. That means I can walk with God's nearness to me, and I can walk as light in the living. So they can understand the God that I have who defends me and the God who intercedes on my behalf. And he's saying this on his own. At the beginning of one of Paul's letters to the Corinthians, he says, you've gone through a whole bunch of problems in your life, a whole bunch of junk, a whole bunch of terrible things, so that you can experience the love and the forgiveness and the comfort of God. And then you can go and comfort others with the same comfort that you've been comforted from God. The purpose isn't just to fix your situation. The purpose is that so you'll become a walking billboard to the loving kindness of God to those who don't have light. And so that's what David says. You've done this so I can walk in the light of the living with this God who's near. I'll walk before God. Now, just as an aside, when he did his whole thing with Ahimelech and Nob and all the lying and all that kind of stuff, he was not walking before the Lord. You know what I'm saying? He was lying his way through his teeth. He was doing everything you think of from a man's perspective. And in the end, the glory was not that of God's. The glory was of David's. And on top of that, David failed and he got apprehended anyway. I mean, everything he did not result in glorifying God. But if he had done differently and placed his trust in God, called upon the name of the Lord, it would have been very different. And indeed, later on when he becomes king, and he does that very visibly and very publicly when they're threatened as a nation by overwhelming odds, he says, this battle is God's and it's not ours. And then when the battle goes their direction, who gets the glory? David the king? No. God the king. And that's why God puts you in circumstances and pulls you out so that you can walk in the land with light and the living and say, you got to understand my God who loves me so intensely, who intercedes on my behalf, and he loves you as well. And he's eager to intercede for you. He loves you so much that every tear you shed, he saves as a treasure in a bottle. That's the God you don't know yet. And that's the God I want you to know. You're a testimony to that. You've taken into account my wanderings, God sees, and you've put my tears in your bottle. And this is the message that not only salves our life when we're in contexts that threaten us, but you need to be a walking testimony to the loving kindness of God, even in the midst of your worst times. Even in the midst of your worst times. And say, can I tell you about the God who pulled me out? The God whose name I called upon, and he came near in the midst of that and loved me and assured me and said, I'll never leave you, I'll never forsake you. Can I tell you about the God who drew near to me, and as I drew near to him, suddenly the fear vanished and the peace and the assurance came, and I could rest even though the circumstances swirled like a tornado in my life and threatened to take everything away? Can I tell you about this God? Well, why should I trust your God? You don't understand his loving kindness. You don't understand how much he loves you and wants to be part of your life. Why are you still stiff-arming him? Why are you still saying, I can do this on my own? Why are you always constantly dealing with the fear of doing it on your own? This God loves you and wants to be part of your life. Now, if we expand that to a larger scale, when we talk about coming to Christ and being a follower of Christ, that's basically the center of our message even there. You have lived your life up to this point on your own. You've stiff-armed God. You've done things on your own. You've been tormented by fear and insufficiency and threat, and you do everything you can think of to stay on top of life, and it's just not working. You're constantly living in this life of trying to cope and the fear that comes with it, and it's just not working. And here you have a God who loves you so much that every tear that you've ever shed is saved in a bottle, and he's waiting to be the one that you put your entire trust into. Will you put your entire trust in this God who loves you so much that he saves every tear you have in a bottle? You do that? Do you understand that while you are still a sinner, Christ died for you to take care of the problem of your own stubborn reliance on yourself while we like sheep have gone astray and gone our own things, gone our own way? And he wants you to trust him fully for all of life. That's his heart's desire. Why should I trust that God? Because he loves you. How do I know? Because he died on your behalf on the cross. That's how we start our walk with Christ. And as circumstances in life get worse, that's how we walk with Christ. And as we walk with him in that way through life, through the turmoil and the horrible times that David will write more about, you become a walking sandwich board saying, God loves me. God is for me. And he can be for you, but you got to put your trust in him. And you got to stop taking big old swords and running into the enemy's camp and thinking, I got this, God, I can handle this, because I guarantee you in life's big picture, it'll come out bad. But when you put your faith and your trust in this God who loves you so immensely, he's eager to intercede on your behalf, and the result is peace and no fear. How many people do you run across in a week that you sense are dealing with a fair amount of fear in their life? Fear about the uncertainties of the future, uncertainties about everything that they cannot control, because, by the way, we can't hardly control anything. And fear for what's going to happen. And in your fleshly imagination, you can take the contexts that are starting to emerge around you, and you can easily see what kind of threat they pose to your life. And if you can't control these things, all you can do is resort to fear. Things that are out of your control. and you think that I'm the only one who loves me, I'm the only one who can intercede on my behalf, I'm the only one that can make me happy, and then sitting right off on the edges is this God who says, I love you immensely. Why won't you let me be part of this? Why won't you invite me into this? Why won't you call on me? Because in the day you call on me, your enemies will recede. And that's the God of the Old Testament and the New. A God whose created beings, us, he loves immensely, and who desires to be included in the context of the strains and stresses of our life, not just because he'll make things pretty, but because he wants you to understand the magnitude of his love for you. So I would maintain this, and I'll kind of close on this. I heard a wise man, a Christian, years ago. He was asked in this particular room by a man, why is it I'm going through all these struggles in my life? And then this man went through and told about the struggles with his children, his grown children. It was a horrible thing. He went through all these things, and all this father could do was tell how heartbroken he was about this event and this event and this event in his children's lives. And they were heartbreaking. They were beyond heartbreaking. And I knew all of us sitting in that room were thinking, yeah, how do you answer that? How do you answer that? Why is he going through that and I'm not? I mean, why? And the man up in front, who I've come to gain great respect for, with tears in his eyes, just said, well, I don't know why, but I know that God doesn't waste a single hard thing you go through. He doesn't waste a single hard thing, because he stores your tears in a bottle. The times that are tough for you are times that are made by God to draw you near to him, for you to understand his loving kindness greater, and for you as a result to be a walking testimony to the loving kindness of God. He doesn't waste any of that stuff. So this is what I want to tell you. When you're in the midst of those circumstances, never forget, God is for me. Tattoo it on your chest or your forehead or in your arm or in your hands. God is for me. He really is for me. Since he's for me, since he has the power of the universe behind him, since his loving kindness is immense beyond all question, I can rest in his loving kindness. And you call upon the name of the Lord and you'll be saved. And that's what Joel 2 says. All those who call upon the name of the Lord will be saved. Because that's the nature of our God. He's not a God far off. He's not a God far off and unconcerned and doesn't want to be bothered by what his children are going through. He's a God who's near, who collects every tear in a bottle and wants to be known by you. And the best way he gets your attention is when things go south. Unfortunately. So if you want to know God, times will be tough, because you'll understand him through those. Okay, we need to quit. Next week, guess what? We're doing Psalm 34. And you know what it says at the beginning of Psalm 34? A psalm of David when he feigned madness before Abimelech and drove him away, and he departed. It's the same story. So we don't have to read the same story in 1 Samuel 21. We're going to dive right into that. It's the only time in these historical psalms where David wrote 2 psalms about one event. And guess what? That event was when David chose poorly all the way through until he realized he was a fool.
Is that why he's in hell? Right?
That's not why he's in hell, because he's not. Yeah. He's not. You can form your, if you're working through that piece of false doctrine, if you're still working that, you can form your own opinion as we go along. David's not in hell. So anyway, read ahead to Psalm 34, and you're already prepped. You read 1 Samuel 20, you know what it's all about. Now, if you're going to write 2 songs, we already wrote 1 song that really had a lot of dominating themes about fear and lack of fear based on putting your trust in the word of who God is. Then what do you write as a second song? What do you do as a follow-up that says anything different? Well, you can read Psalm 34 before we get there, but that's what we'll look at next week, okay? When David was at his lowest and tried to save himself and couldn't, and God interceded anyway. Okay, let's pray. Father, what a remarkable story this is. A remarkable story. And yet, Lord, I have to confess, I'm awfully quick to jump to the conclusion in hard straits that you're not watching. Or jump to the conclusion that maybe your love really isn't quite as big as I thought it was. And Lord, I know all of us are in that situation. Forgive us when our fear screams out that God doesn't love me. But God, we're in tough things sometimes. We're in some really hard things. And it doesn't take a crystal ball to figure out how threatening these things can be, because they march on and they seem to devour our lives. God, I pray that through your Spirit, you would just remind us of those 4 little words, that God is for me. And that as we call upon your name and ask you to draw near to our circumstance, that you would reveal to us the immensity of the loving kindness of this God who has such devotion to us in the immediacy of our circumstance, that you proclaim that you'll never leave us, never forsake us, never go away. And God, I thank you that you are the God that is near, rather than the God who's far. I'm glad that you're not a God who asks for us to be worthy enough before you'll intercede, because David certainly wasn't worthy. He made every wrong choice in this entire situation. Every wrong choice. Until he realized he was a fool. God, we are encouraged by your great loving kindness to us, proven through the death and resurrection of Christ, the one who took our sins upon himself in fullness, complete, past, present, and future, and as a result has washed us clean and made us to be children adopted into this loving Father who loves us and who is for us. So we know you love us. Just help us remember when the circumstances get so huge that we're tempted to forget. Thank you for your love for us in Jesus' name. Amen.